And sometimes players don't give us what we're looking for early, so you have to hold out hope. This Jets team has a couple of those players, in my opinion at least, that were drafted maybe a little bit too high. We could debate on some of these guys. But Garrett Wilson is leaving fantasy managers with a lot of questions right now, just given his performance. Obviously, in the rain, a tough matchup against Patrick Surtain, but it's worth talking about because we haven't seen the top 12 Garrett Wilson that was drafted. And obviously, Aaron Rodgers is starting to spread the thing out a little bit more. Mike Williams, Alan Lazard, Tyler Conklin, the running backs. Before we get into the running backs, though, what are your thoughts on Garrett Wilson? Because to me, I see a guy who we probably over-assumed in his role, also with some tough matchups coming up, but should be better at some point in the season. Like, I don't think we're going to get wide receiver 3 version of Garrett Wilson every single week. I think he'll be better. I just don't know if I see top 5, top 7, which the market in our mind is like he should be a top 5 to 7 guy. I think right now when it comes to Garrett Wilson, I would be holding on to him, like holding until he has better days. Or if you could sell the name value at wide receiver 1 price, then do it. Because I think his price right now in my head, Tyler, I think rest of the season he's a wide receiver 2.
I think he's one of the best buy low people out there. Personally, I think I know it hasn't been great. This is a brutal matchup too, and the other thing too is like it's just. I still think this offense just is not hitting its stride. And this is a really tough matchup. And I think I don't know what their schedule's like. They get the Bills, the Steelers, but then it clears up a little bit.
Ahead. They got Stephon Gilmore, you got Rasul Douglas, Joey Porter Jr., another matchup with Christian Gonzalez, and then Derek Stingley in Week 9 before the Cardinals and Colts, which should be that should be like the
that's like you look at that stretch of games. You get the Cardinals, you get the Colts, you get the Seahawks, you get Miami, Jacksonville, the Rams. I think it's a really good second half of the season. And for me personally, like I just believe in the talent of Garrett Wilson. I think he's fantastic. And I think that him and Aaron Rodgers just aren't on the same page yet. And part of the reason why is like why is Aaron Rodgers gonna go at Patrick Surtain? Like there's no point. So and it's not even like Garrett Wilson. I don't even think he had that bad of a day in terms of like going against Patrick Surtain. Like 5 catches, 41 yards isn't awful. Like that's not awful. I know it's awful for where he was drafted for sure, but like it's not even that bad of a day in terms of like against this defense and how well this defense has been playing against some of these top wide receiver 1s. So I think he's a guy that still seeing the targets. It's not like other guys are out targeting him. He's still the lead in this team, seeing the most targets, seeing the highest target share, the highest air yard share. I think it's only a matter of time until him and like Aaron Rodgers kind of figured things out. I'm definitely buying in on him. I think he's a wide receiver 1 for the rest.
So is this just because of your takes? So like because you had him as a top 5 guy, do you think it's easy to get stuck on Takeville or where you drafted somebody? Because I kind of feel like that about Bijan for me. Like sometimes I have like blind optimism and I don't always I think of like the potential and I'm like, okay, Bijan, maybe he's the RB15 right now. But I know that there's elements like he's just missing the touchdowns or he hasn't had the big games yet. And I know I could get stuck in Takeville sometimes. And that's part of what we do, not even just us as creators, but like guys you just believe in, guys you believe in a talent. And on real football, maybe they have a certain role for their team. But for our fantasy teams, maybe they're not producing at the level that we want them to. Like, is that a player for you? Because like I mentioned, with Bijan, it's easy for me. But when I see Garrett Wilson, I see a guy that's like, with the quarterback that's not going to throw for probably more than 4,000 yards, probably going to be under 4,000 yards, in an offense that doesn't really need him to be the guy because you got the 2 strong running backs, you have other receivers. Is this a guy that maybe we're just, you know what I mean? Like we're kind of holding on to that. We drafted him as a wide receiver 1 and we're expecting him to be that because of the talent. Like I know it's a tough thing to like kind of let go of, and I'm not saying you are or aren't, but like I kind of feel like that's a player that the community might have just had a rank too high, you know?
No, I understand, but I think like the reason why he's being drafted that high, is because of the talent, right? Like you're drafting him that high because of the talent, the situation, and like we see it all the time. Guys have slow starts to the season. I mean, last year, Jamar Chase was a little bit slow because
CeeDee Lamb last year.
CeeDee Lamb, he was outside the top 12 of wide receivers the first 4 weeks of the season. I'm sure there's even more guys that I can try to look up here really quickly while I'm trying to talk. Yeah. But like you're and the other thing too is like Do I think Aaron Rodgers is going to I think that Aaron Rodgers will throw around 4,000 yards. Yes. And I understand of what you're saying in terms of like getting stuck in takes. Like that happens a lot because you have a lot of faith in these kind of guys and you don't want to hop off the takes. But at the same time, and this kind of what I was saying earlier, right? Like you don't want to sit there and admire your team if you're 1-4 or if you're 4-0 and it's early in the season. Yeah, you probably did a great job, but it's a long season, right? Like guys will struggle, guys then explode. Like we could be talking about Garrett Wilson so differently if for the next 2 weeks he scores over 20 fantasy points in both the games.
Yes.
Like, so for me personally, like I'm not, yes, there's comes a point when you want to hop off your take. I think that's more of like early season. If he's not seeing the targets that you thought he was going to see, or they're not seeing the work that you thought they're going to see, then yeah. But as long as they're seeing that, I think that there's still hope that they can still get to that point of what you thought in the season. Maybe they don't finish there, but they can get probably pretty close if they start to have this big blowout or big blow up in the second half of the season, which I think that like he still can do. I
That's
feel
another
good about
thing
it.
too, is that even with takes, you have to look at like, can they produce at that level? Say they miss the first 3-4 weeks. A guy like Garrett Wilson, I'm glad you said that because it's easy to move off of your take and be like, I don't believe. But the reason I still believe in a Bijan Robinson is because of all the fundamentals that were in place before we drafted. And just because he hasn't had a strong stretch of games doesn't mean that those fundamentals still aren't there. You talked about it last year, guys that were outside of the top 12 with the position that finished top 12 at the receiver position. CeeDee Lamb, DJ Moore, Jamar Chase. These guys were all outside of the top 12 after week 4. So I'm there with you, man. I'm not there on Garrett Wilson, but I'm glad you said that because I do think if you believe in a player, especially if you believe in Garrett Wilson, and you did a lot of your homework and you see the resemblance is there. Like we know the targets are there, the things you want to see are there. We just haven't seen on the field. So I'm not mad you did that. Another one of the jet set is up there. Breece Hall. I have some concern about him as well. Obviously coming off of a subpar game for Breece Hall standards. Talks about Braelon Allen being more involved. And we've covered this a little bit. We talked about Braelon Allen in his increasing role. I'm not sure what this looks like moving forward, but it sounds like the team is still behind Breece Hall. Robert Saleh came out and said, Breece is our workhorse. So there's no questions about if it's going to be a split. It's how much does Braelon Allen start to eat this? Because he's playing really well right now. We got to admit it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the same thing with Breece Hall, and he's dominating the important snaps that you want to see. Like he's dominating the goal line, he's dominating the receiving work. If he sees like you could look at the situation kind of, and it's not there yet. I don't even want to say this, but it's like Jahmyr Gibbs, right? Where like Jahmyr Gibbs is this guy who he doesn't play 100% of the snaps. And the other thing too is like you see some of these guys losing their snap share a little bit, but as long as they're like 60%, like 70% of the snaps, like that's fine. If it's a 70-30 split, that's okay because you don't want your guy playing 90% of the snaps. Those guys are not going to last throughout the season if they're literally seeing 90% of the workload. That doesn't happen. So for me personally, like I'm not like, do I think it maybe could limit his upside a little bit? Potentially, but like it was a dud week. And I think that this offense just kind of struggled. And yeah, Braelon Allen had the better day. Breece didn't, but also I want to say Breece had 3 goal line attempts. That kind of lowers that yards per carry average because it's, only 3 times at the goal line. It still wasn't a good day at all for Breece, but compared to what he was doing early in the season, he was averaging like over 18 fantasy points per game those first 3 games. I'm not going to overreact to one game. I think he'll be fine. He's still seeing the workload that you want to see, the snaps that you want to see. We could have a different conversation maybe in like week 8, but as of right now, I'm not really that concerned.
Yeah, there's no need to panic on Breece Hall. And even somebody who didn't draft Breece Hall, and I think the only thing I would say is that Braelon Allen taking work would probably cap his ceiling a little bit. So I agree with you there. But to be honest, we haven't even seen a big game out of Breece Hall yet. It's been a lot of just like the volume, 15, 16 carries for like 60 yards. We've seen, a lot of the receiving work that we saw last year. So this is another case of like the elements are still there. It's just Braelon Allen is on them heels. And so I think you talked about it in a few weeks. If we're still having the same conversation, now we're getting 40% to 50%. But I think for now, there's no need to panic on these guys. No. It's week 4. And if you were panicking on them, I think you can have some concern. There's no need to panic sell, panic trade, etc.